April 18, 1942. Before sunrise. The Western Pacific is restless, steel gray under a low sky. On the flight deck of the USS Hornet, an aircraft sits where it was never meant to be. A B-25 Michelin Army bomber rests inches from the bow. Its wings stretch wide across a carrier deck designed for lighter machines. There is no arresting gear ahead. There will be no return landing. Salt spray lashes the fuselage. Wind tears across the deck at over 30 knots. Engines idle low, vibrating the air with restrained violence. Men stand silent nearby. Pilots, deck crews, observers who have already done the math. Every calculation said the same thing. The runway is too short. The margin is too thin. The consequences, absolute. Far below. Waves slam against the hull. Ahead, only the empty ocean, and beyond it, Japan. At the controls, the pilot waits for the signal. Fuel tanks are full. Bombs are armed. There is no plan for what comes after. When the throttles advance, this aircraft will either fly or vanish into the sea, taking an idea, a crew, and America's answer with it. The world that made the mission necessareth war, that brought the B-25 to a carrier deck, began in fire and disbelief. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor without warning. Battleships burned at their moorings. Aircraft were destroyed where they stood. More than 2,400 Americans were dead before the morning ended. The physical damage was severe. The psychological damage was worse. For the first time since the War of 1812, the continental United States faced an enemy capable of projecting power across the ocean. Japan appeared unstoppable, its fleet modern, aggressive, and precise. In the weeks that followed Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. By early 1942, the strategic balance in the Pacific was stark. Japan held the initiative. America was reacting. The United States Navy had lost battleships, but not its aircraft carriers. That fact mattered more than anyone yet understood. Carrier warfare was still evolving, still misunderstood even by its practitioners. But carriers were now the only American assets capable of striking back across the vast Pacific. There was a problem. No American aircraft could reach Japan. Army bombers lacked the range from existing bases. Navy carrier aircraft lacked the payload to do meaningful damage. Japan's home islands lay beyond practical reach, protected not just by distance, but by confidence. Tokyo had not been bombed in modern history. Neither had Yokohama, Kobe, or Nagoya. Japanese military planners believed reasonably that no enemy could reach them without first winning decisive naval battles. For the American public, this reality was crushing. Newspapers carried daily lists of defeats. Families listened to radio reports describing retreats, evacuations, and sinking ships. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something essential. Wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by belief. The United States needed a victory, or at least the appearance of one. Something bold enough to shatter the idea that Japan was untouchable. Inside the Pentagon and Navy Department, discussions turned unconventional, risky, previously unthinkable. What if bombers could be launched from carriers? The idea violated doctrine on both sides of the American military. The United States Army Air Forces operated medium and heavy bombers from long runways. They did not belong at sea. The United States Navy, meanwhile, built carriers for light, agile aircraft designed to land back aboard. A medium bomber like the B-25 Mitchell weighed more than twice as much as most carrier aircraft. Its wingspan, landing speed, and takeoff requirements made carrier operations appear absurd on paper. Yet paper was all the United States had left. By January 1942, the Pacific Fleet's surviving carriers, among them USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, were conducting hit-and-run raids against Japanese outposts. These raids caused limited physical damage, but they proved something crucial. Carriers could approach the enemy undetected, strike, and disappear. Still, none of those strikes touched Japan itself. In Washington, frustration hardened into resolve. Military planners were no longer asking if the United States could strike Japan. They were asking how much risk was acceptable to do it. It was in this atmosphere of urgency, improvisation, and psychological warfare that a radical proposal began circulating quietly among senior officers. A proposal that would demand engineers to ignore margins, pilots accept near certain loss of aircraft, and commanders gamble prestige, lives, and ships on a single throw. The idea had not yet taken shape, but the pressure that would force it into existence was already unavoidable. The idea that should not have worked. Its concept did not emerge from a committee room or a formal doctrine paper. It surfaced quietly, almost accidentally, at the intersection of desperation and imagination. In January 1942, Francis S. Lowe, a staff officer for the U.S. Navy, observed Army bombers conducting short field takeoff practice. Watching them lift off from an unusually short runway, he saw something few others had considered seriously. If a bomber could leave the ground in that distance and if a carrier could steam into the wind, then maybe, just maybe, an Army aircraft could be launched at sea. The idea moved quickly up the chain. President Roosevelt approved exploration of the concept within days. There would be no official paper trail, no publicity, and no margin for embarrassment. If it failed, it would never officially exist. The Army Air Forces were tasked with selecting an aircraft. It had to be small enough to fit on a carrier deck, yet powerful enough to reach Japan and escape. Twin engines were mandatory for reliability over water. The aircraft also needed rugged construction and forgiving handling. The choice narrowed rapidly. The B-25 Mitchell, designed by North American Aviation, emerged as the least impossible option. It was not designed for carriers. It was not designed for ultra-short takeoff. But it could be modified and it could be flown by crews willing to accept extraordinary risk. To lead the operation, the Army selected a man whose reputation matched the mission's audacity. James H. Doolittle was already a legend, a former racing pilot, aeronautical engineer, and pioneer of instrument flying. Doolittle combined technical mastery with a calm acceptance of danger. He understood aircraft limits and how to bend them without breaking. Doolittle accepted the assignment without hesitation. Training began in February 1942 at Eglin Field, under strict secrecy. Crews were told only that they were preparing for an exceptionally hazardous mission. They practiced takeoffs at maximum weight, using runway lengths shorter than anything prescribed by manuals. Every foot mattered. Pilots learned to release brakes at full throttle. Control inputs were refined to the inch. Errors were studied, corrected, and drilled out. Meanwhile, engineers stripped the aircraft of anything non-essential. Defensive armament was reduced. Navigation equipment was simplified. Extra fuel tanks were installed wherever space allowed. The goal was brutal in its simplicity. Get airborne. Reach Japan. Do not expect to come back. Mathematically, the plane remained barely viable. Carrier decks offered roughly 500 feet of usable takeoff space. A fully loaded B-25 typically required more than twice that distance. The solution relied on every possible advantage: strong headwinds, maximum engine output, perfect technique. Naval aviators watching the training were skeptical. Some were openly dismissive. Engineers ran calculations repeatedly. They adjusted weight, wind assumptions, and power settings. The numbers never became comfortable. To many, the mission looked less like planning and more like gambling. By March 1942, USS Hornet was quietly modified to accommodate the bombers. 16 B-25s were craned aboard and secured on the flight deck, leaving no space for normal air operations. Once at sea, the carrier would be unable to recover aircraft. The ship itself became part of the weapon. In early April, the task force slipped into the Pacific under radio silence. Only a handful of men knew the target. Fewer still understood the full scope of what would happen once the bombers lifted off. As the carriers moved westward, the margin for alternatives disappeared. There would be no abort option, no second attempt. Ahead lay Japan. Behind them, nothing but open ocean and the quiet knowledge that the moment of decision was approaching. The men who volunteered for the mission were not told where they were going. They were only told the odds. 16 crews, 80 airmen. Every one of them understood that the aircraft would not return to the carrier. Most assumed they would not return at all. There were no speeches before departure, no dramatic vows, just quiet preparation and professional routine. Some pilots wrote letters home, careful with their words. Others chose not to write anything, unwilling to leave behind a farewell that might never be answered. Fear was present, but contained, pressed down beneath discipline and habit. What unsettled them most was not enemy fire. It was the takeoff. Carrier pilots were trained for short decks. Army bomber pilots were not. For weeks, these men had practiced launching heavy aircraft with almost no runway, knowing that any hesitation, any uneven throttle, any overcorrection would end in the sea. The crews trusted their pilots. The pilots trusted their aircraft. And everyone trusted the plan, because there was no alternative left. The B-25 Mitchell was a land-based medium bomber, built for conventional warfare. Its presence on a carrier deck violated every assumption behind its design. Normally, it carried defensive guns, armor, and redundant systems. For this mission, almost everything expendable was removed. Even the tail guns were replaced with painted broomsticks, enough to bluff an enemy fighter at a distance, but nothing more. Fuel tanks filled the bomb bay and fuselage. Bomb loads were reduced, trading destruction for range. The aircraft became a flying compromise, yet the B-25 had one trait that mattered above all others. It was forgiving. Its controls were stable. Its engines were reliable. And in the hands of skilled pilots, it could be coaxed into flight under conditions that would ground more delicate aircraft. Doolittle himself insisted on flying the first plane, not for glory but because he wanted to prove it could be done. The USS Hornet was never meant to be a bomber launcher. Her deck was designed for fighters and dive bombers that could land again. With 16 B-25s parked noses to tail, she became something entirely different. There were no spare feet on the deck, no room for error. Every takeoff required the carrier to steam at maximum speed, directly into the wind. Naval officers aboard understood the stakes. If the bombers could not launch, the carrier would be forced to turn back with its mission exposed and its secrecy shattered. Below decks, sailors listened to the engines overhead and waited. They knew history was pressing down on their ship, one aircraft at a time. As dawn approached on April 18, 1942, the sea grew rougher. Wind increased. Clouds lowered. Ahead of the task force, Japanese patrol boats had already been sighted. The element of surprise was slipping away, and with it, the last margin of safety. No part of the mission survived without senior leaders accepting consequences that could not be undone. Overall naval command rested with William F. Halsey, a commander known for aggression and impatience with caution. Halsey understood carriers. He also understood what losing one would mean in early 1942 when the U.S. Navy could count its operational flatops on one hand. Launching Army bombers from USS Hornet meant rendering the carrier temporarily insolvent. Her air wing could not operate normally. Her deck would be cluttered until the final aircraft left it. Yet Halsey approved the risk without hesitation. Above him, in Washington, Roosevelt accepted something equally stark. The raid might fail entirely. The bombers might ditch at sea. Crews might be captured or killed. Japan might retaliate brutally, but leadership weighed cost against necessity. The United States needed to demonstrate reach, not victor presence. Doolittle, for his part, made a quieter decision. By insisting on flying the first aircraft, he placed himself in the same danger as the youngest crewman. It was not symbolism, it was insurance. If the first bomber failed to lift off, the mission would end there. No pilot would follow a disaster into the water. In Japan, April 1940 felt distant from the war's front lines. The Imperial Navy had struck Pearl Harbor. Its armies were winning across Asia. Tokyo was busy, functioning, and confident. Japan's defensive doctrine assumed warning time. If American carriers approached, they would be detected early, long before aircraft could threaten the home islands. The Pacific itself was considered a barrier. Radar coverage was incomplete. Long-range patrols were limited, and no serious plan existed for defending against medium bombers appearing suddenly over cities. When Japanese picket vessels spotted the American task force on April 18th, it triggered reports but not alarm. The assumption was simple: carriers launch carrier aircraft, and those aircraft could not reach Tokyo from that distance. That assumption was about to collapse. In Tokyo, air defense units were on routine footing. Fighter squadrons were dispersed. Anti-aircraft batteries were unmanned or partially crewed. The idea that American Army bombers could be inbound at low altitude without warning did not fit any existing threat model, and threat models, once broken, tend to shatter violently. As reports filtered upward through Japanese command channels, minutes were lost to disbelief, time that could never be recovered. Out at sea, Admiral Halsey faced his own clock. The task force had been sighted earlier than planned. The launch point was still hundreds of miles farther east than ideal. Fuel margins were razor thin. There would be no delay, no adjustment, no recalculation. The order was given: launch immediately. On the pitching deck of USS Hornet, crews moved into position. Engines roared to life, and the first B-25 rolled forward toward a takeoff no one had ever attempted before. The order came at 8:20 hours. There was no ceremony, no countdown broadcast over loudspeakers, just hand signals, engine checks, and the rising howl of twin radial engines pushed toward their limits. The sea was rougher than planned. Waves slammed into the bow of USS Hornet, sending spray high enough to wet the forward flight deck. The carrier turned hard into the wind, pushing every knot of speed her engines could provide. At the head of the deck sat aircraft. No, for Oda 3 for 4, the first B-25 Mitchell. At its controls was James H. Doolittle. The bomber's nose wheel rested barely yards from the edge. Ahead of it, nothing. Doolittle advanced the throttles to full power while holding the brakes. Engines strained. The aircraft shook violently, eager to break free. A final signal. Brakes released. The B-25 surged forward, accelerating across the deck far faster than anyone expected or feared. The carrier pitched downward on a swell, just as the aircraft reached the bow, momentarily extending the takeoff angle by chance alone. Then the deck ended. For a fraction of a second, the bomber dropped, not climbing, falling. Crewmen watching held their breath as the wheels vanished below the bow. Salt spray enveloped the fuselage. Then dash lift. The aircraft clawed upward, engine screaming, wings heavy with fuel and bombs. It cleared the water by feet. Doolittle did not look back. The success of the first launch unlocked the rest. One by one, the remaining B-25s moved forward. Each takeoff was its own trial. Some aircraft rolled longer than expected. Others lifted unevenly, wings rocking as pilots fought the controls. One bomber veered slightly toward the island superstructure before correcting at the last instant. There were no second attempts, no go-arounds. Each aircraft committed fully or not at all. Deck crews worked with mechanical precision. Fuel fumes hung in the air. Engine noise drowned out all thought. By 9:19, the 16th and final bomber left the deck. The flight deck fell silent. 16 Army bombers now flew eastward low over the waves toward a country that believed itself beyond reach. Behind them, USS Hornet turned away at flank speed, her mission complete but her vulnerability exposed. Ahead, the bombers faced hours of flight, dwindling fuel, and an enemy waking to an impossible reality. The most dangerous part of the mission was over. The most consequential part was about to begin. The bombers flew low for hours, skimming just above the surface of the Pacific. Altitude was the enemy. Fuel was the enemy. Every unnecessary climb shaved miles from a margin that barely existed. Radio silence was absolute. No course corrections. No reassurance. Each crew navigated alone, guided by dead reckoning and faith in their calculations. As the Japanese coastline emerged from the haze, the pilots climbed. Not high, just enough to clear terrain and line up their targets. At approximately 12 o'clock local time, the first B-25 reached the outskirts of Tokyo. There were no sirens. Factories continued operating. Streetcars moved through intersections. Civilians looked up in confusion as unfamiliar aircraft passed overhead, too large to be Japanese, too calm to be enemy fighters. Anti-aircraft batteries reacted late. Some did not fire at all. Then the bombs fell. Targets were deliberately modest: aircraft factories, steel works, oil storage facilities, dockyards, and military installations. The bombers made single passes. There were no circling runs, no corrections. They dropped their payloads and turned away immediately, descending to low altitude once more. Damage on the ground was limited. This was not a city-destroying raid, but the psychological effect was immediate and profound. Japanese air defenses scrambled. Fighters rose to late and to scattered to mount effective pursuit. Anti-aircraft fire increased as the bombers departed, but accuracy remained poor. Across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, the same pattern repeated. Sudden appearance, brief violence, abrupt disappearance. Within minutes, it was over. The bombers turned southwest toward China. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. The weather deteriorated. What had been planned, the daylight raid followed by controlled landings, now became a race against darkness, storms, and exhaustion. One by one, aircraft ran out of fuel. Crews bailed out over Chinese territory. Others crash-landed in fields, rivers, and hillsides. All 16 aircraft were lost. The cost was severe. 8 airmen were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed after a show trial. 1 died in captivity. Yet none of the bombers had fallen over Japan itself. None had been shot down in combat. Japan had been struck and could not pretend otherwise. In Tokyo, disbelief turned to anger, then to urgency. The Imperial Command launched internal investigations. Defensive doctrine was rewritten overnight. The myth of invulnerability was dead. For the United States, news of the raid spread carefully at first, then explosively. Headlines spoke of bombers over Tokyo, of retaliation, of reach. Doolittle, believing the mission a failure due to aircraft losses, expected court-martial. Instead, he would receive the Medal of Honor. But the raid's true impact was not measured in medals or craters. It was measured in decisions, yet to come decisions that would pull fleets toward a tiny atoll called Midway. And as those consequences began to unfold, the war itself quietly shifted direction. When the engines went silent, the mission did not end. It only fragmented. Across eastern China, American airmen descended into darkness by parachute, by crash landing, by desperate improvisation. Some crews bailed out into rain-soaked hills. Others rode damaged aircraft into muddy fields or river banks, skidding until metal tore and fuel spilled. Chinese civilians found them first: farmers, villagers, local resistance members. Despite the danger, they hid the Americans, fed them, guided them towards safety. Many had little to give and much to lose. Japanese occupation forces responded with brutal efficiency once they realized what had happened. Entire villages were punished. Civilians were executed. Estimates vary, but historians agree that tens of thousands of Chinese civilians died in reprisals following the raid. The strategic raid on Japan cast a long shadow across occupied China. 8 American airmen were captured. They were interrogated, beaten, and subjected to a military trial that violated international law. 3 were executed by firing squad in October 1942. A 4th would die from disease and malnutrition in captivity. The rest survived years as prisoners of war. Back in the United States, the government initially withheld details. Operational security remained paramount, but within days, President Roosevelt acknowledged the strike. When asked where the bombers came from, he answered simply, "Shangri-La." The name stuck. Newspapers printed maps of Japan with arrows pointing inward. Radio broadcasts carried the story into homes still raw from Pearl Harbor. For the first time since December 1941, Americans heard not of retreat but of initiative. The physical damage in Japan was minor. Factories repaired quickly. Production resumed. But confidence did not. Japanese civilians had watched enemy bombers fly unchallenged over their capital. Military leaders had been forced to admit a truth they had denied. The war could reach home. Inside the Japanese high command, blame was assigned. Picket lines were reinforced. Air defense units were reorganized. Carrier doctrine was scrutinized. Most importantly, a conclusion hardened. American carriers had to be destroyed. The Doolittle Raid had not changed the balance of forces, but it had changed priorities, and that shift would pull the Imperial Navy toward a decisive gamble in the Central Pacific, one that would unfold sooner than anyone expected. In Tokyo, the response was swift and revealing. The raid forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to confront a failure it could not disguise. The homeland had been breached not by overwhelming force, but by ingenuity. 16 bombers, 1 carrier, a plan that should never have worked. The conclusion drawn by Japanese planners was not restraint. It escalated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, had already believed that the United States would recover and strike back. The Doolittle Raid confirmed his fear. Time was now Japan's enemy. American aircraft carriers, still largely intact, had proven they could approach Japan undetected. Those carriers had to be destroyed, decisively, before American industrial power could fully mobilize. Within weeks, Yamamoto accelerated plans for a decisive engagement. The objective was to lure U.S. carriers into a trap and annihilate them. The location chosen was a remote atoll in the Central Pacific. Midway. The Japanese plan was complex, layered, and confident, perhaps too confident. It assumed American confusion. It assumed Japanese operational superiority would remain intact. It underestimated one thing: how seriously the United States had taken lessons in intelligence, coordination, and carrier warfare. In June 1942, less than 2 months after the Doolittle Raid, those assumptions would collapse in the Battle of Midway. For Japanese fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Deer-in would be lost. The balance of naval power in the Pacific would tilt irreversibly. Historians continue to debate causality. The Doolittle Raid did not cause Midway, but it sharpened urgency. It pulled timelines forward. It pressured decisions that might otherwise have waited. For the United States, the raid's impact endured in quieter ways. It proved that joint operations, Army bombers launched by Navy carriers, were not only possible, but devastatingly effective when coordinated. It reinforced the centrality of aircraft carriers as capital ships of the modern age, and it demonstrated that morale, once broken, could be rebuilt through action rather than reassurance. James Doolittle would later say the raid achieved little militarily. In the tonnage destroyed, he was correct. In belief restored, he was not. The raid gave Americans permission to imagine victory again, and it forced Japanese planners to imagine defeat. As the war ground on, with battles measured in fleets and islands and years, the Doolittle Raid receded into legend, but its influence lingered, quiet, disproportionate, and decisive. The story of that influence does not end with strategy or statistics. It ends with meaning. In military history, success is often measured in territory taken or fleets destroyed. The Doolittle Raid left neither behind. 16 bombers never returned. The city struck and recovered quickly. On paper, the mission looked expendable, but wars are not fought on paper. On April 18, 1942, a boundary shifted quietly, almost invisibly, not a line on a map, but an assumption in the mind. That distance alone could protect a nation. That technology had fixed limits. That shock belonged only to the attacker. A medium bomber lifting from a carrier deck rewrote those ideas. It showed that engineering rules could be bent by preparation and nerve. That joint warfare, once resisted by tradition, could become a weapon in itself. And that morale, once broken, could be repaired not by speeches, but by action. For the men who flew the mission, the raid became a lifetime memory of risk accepted without applause. Some would never return home. Others carried the weight of survival for decades. For Japan, the raid planted doubt where confidence had stood. It accelerated decisions, hardened defenses, and pulled the war closer to home. And for the United States, it marked the moment when fear began to loosen its grip. The empty deck of USS Hornet that morning told the story best. An aircraft carrier designed for one purpose had been transformed into something else entirely by necessity, by imagination, and by resolve. The bomber that rolled off her bow should not have flown. Engineers were right about the risk. The margins were real. But history is not shaped by margins alone. Sometimes, it is shaped by a single takeoff, from a deck to short, toward a horizon no one believed could be reached.